This episode is brought to you by The Build, a new podcast from the guys behind Sincera, Mike O'Sullivan and Ian Myers. They built their company by figuring out clever solutions to a few important ad tech problems in their industry. And that's exactly what this show is about. Mike and Ian interview some of the smartest tech minds in the biz to hear about how they identified opportunities, solved their hardest challenges, and grew their businesses in the process. Listen to The Build with Mike O'Sullivan wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is sponsored by Bead AI. We've all been there. You're days away from a deadline and you remember a brilliant idea from a brainstorming session, but you can't find it in your notes. It's frustrating, confusing, and frankly, a waste of time. Recently, I've integrated Bead AI, that's P-L-A-U-D, into my daily workflow, and it's a game changer for staying organized. Bead isn't just an app, it's a hardware-software powerhouse. I use the Note Pro for phone calls, Note Pen for my in-person meetings, and the new Bead desktop app for all my virtual sessions. With one click, it records everything and generates an accurate, searchable transcript. But the real magic is the Ask Bead feature. I can literally ask questions about a meeting from 3 weeks ago and get an instant answer. It turns every conversation into a searchable asset for me and my team. Stop taking notes and focus. Turn your meetings into actionable insights with the world's most advanced AI note taker. Learn more at plaud.ai. That's Plaud.ai. And use the promo code CODESTORY, all one word, to get 10% off your purchase. Today's episode is brought to you by .tech domains, and this one hits close to home. Back in 2016, I was building my startup and went hunting for that perfect .com and found next to nothing. So I did what every founder does. Settled. Here's what I wish someone had told me. You're building a tech startup. Just get a .tech domain. It instantly tells investors and customers what you're about. Don't overthink it. Secure your .tech domain today from any registrar of your choice. This episode is sponsored by Unblocked. Unblocked is the context layer your agents are missing. It synthesizes your PRs, docs, Slack, and tickets into organizational context that agents actually understand. So they make better plans, write higher quality code, use fewer tokens, and require fewer correction loops. If you're running Claude Code, Cursor, or any agentic workflow, Unblocked is worth a look. Learn more at getunblocked.com/codestory. This episode is sponsored by Mesmo. If your team is collecting large volumes of logs, metrics, and traces, but still struggling to get timely answers, Mesmo can help. Mesmo is an active telemetry platform that processes and enriches observability data in real time before it's stored or analyzed. That means lower data volume, lower cost, and faster root cause analysis across your existing observability tools. To see how it works, get a demo at mesmo.com/codestory. That's MEZMO.com/codestory. This episode is sponsored by BrainGrid. If you are building with AI coding tools, but your features keep breaking, you need to check out BrainGrid. It is the product management agent for AI builders. BrainGrid turns messy ideas into clear specs, tasks, and prompts that coding agents like Cursor and Claude can actually build the right way. Ship real software, not fragile prototypes. Start free at braingrid.ai. Hello, listeners. Today we are dropping another episode in our chat series, specifically on the founder side, hearing from those scaling the companies themselves. In this episode, we are talking with Daulet Amirkhanov, founding engineer of Bead AI. Daulet is going to take us through his years at Meta and Cognee, leading into how he's building Bead AI to take on compliance audits in AI automation. Daulet, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for being on Code Story.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Really excited to dive into all of your experience into Bead AI, the things that you've taken away from the work that you've done. You've gone through a few years of high throughput reliability infrastructure at Meta, right? To engineering the GraphRAG engine and semantic memory systems at Cognee. And now you're founding engineer at Bead AI. So you've run the gamut. You've done some big things. You built some big things. And Bead AI is an Andreessen Horowitz-backed startup building autonomous agent infrastructure for compliance audits. Okay, so here's the question. How did that journey shape the way that you think about engineering for the age of autonomous systems?
Early on in my career, as you mentioned, I worked on high throughput reliability infrastructure at Meta. And that early experience has helped me to build the foundations of myself as a software engineer, as well as a problem solver in general. In retrospect, I'm really glad for the way that I worked first at Meta, because right after Meta, I think with the proliferation of autonomous systems, agentic systems, it has helped me to leverage my experience that I've gained early on in my career and make me just much more efficient software engineer by leveraging autonomous systems. And I think it has shaped me as early on as a problem solver and a solid software engineer, but now as a problem solver with these really awesome agentic and autonomous systems at my disposal to be a several X more efficient problem solver.
Absolutely. No, that makes total sense. And, it's empowering a lot. And it sounds like it's empowered you a lot in your development lifecycle. Before we dive in a little bit deeper into that, tell me about you, maybe outside of technology. What do you do for fun?
Outside of technology, whenever I can, I go take my cycle and go out of the city as far as I can. Of course, a couple times a year when I can, I'm really avid fan of skiing. And I also do run whenever I can. But lately, I've just been fully committed to cycling. But I think other than that, yeah, it's been just coding and cycling, I think. That's how you could summarize most of the time that I spent.
Okay, let's dive into a little bit deeper into the Meta years, right? Let's zoom into it a bit. Meta is obviously a big scale company. And for those that haven't worked at that type of scale, right? What was the exact piece of logging and reliability infrastructure that you owned? And you mentioned this word earlier, high throughput. What does high throughput actually mean in numbers there? And I think to take that a step further, what's one specific architectural decision from those years that has been foundational in how you build software even today?
So let me start from first one. I've been working, as you mentioned, at Meta, working on high throughput systems. And what I mean by high throughput systems is I could probably start by saying that most of the time that I worked at Meta, I worked in ads. So it's the backbone of the company financially, but also it's the part of the company that faces the most traffic. So when people say billions of active users, those billions usually hit first the ads infrastructure. And the part that I was working on was part of the ads. And it was only a fraction of the overall traffic, but still it was at the smallest, it was millions of log hitting our systems daily. And that's just a tiny fraction of the overall ads product. Specifically, I was working in a part of the ads that's called Shops ads. It's an internal Shops framework, Shops product that is currently available for US, customers, users. And I was working specifically on logging. I did both logging and reliability, but most of the time I worked on logging. I worked at Meta for a bit over 3 years, and I think I worked on so many interesting projects. The thing that still shapes me as both as a software engineer, but as a problem solver in general is at that scale and with that, at that scale and with that throughput, what you want to do at Meta is move fast, ship things fast, and ship as small as fast as you can. So that kind of mindset of chunking your problem into smallest digestible pieces that you can ship as fast and check your hypothesis as fast with, that's stuck with me ever since. And I think it's kind of one of those things that still shapes me the way I approach things, especially as a software engineer to this day. And I think that's kind of one thing that I really took away from those years.
Yeah, sure. That's core to software development and shipping the essentially smaller commits, right? Or shipping smaller pieces so that you can move more agile. That makes total sense to me. A lot of infrastructure engineers, they stay infra, right? And you made a deliberate move from human scale systems at Meta to agent scale systems at Cognee, right? So what did you see in that moment that convinced you AI agent infrastructure was the next distributed systems frontier and not just the current hype cycle? I'm really interested to hear what you have to say there.
So as I mentioned, I worked in infrastructure for most of the time that I was at Meta, but just before I make the switch, I internally made a decision when I was working at Meta to work and pursue my interests on ML systems, specifically personalized recommendation systems at ads. And that was my first step that I took because I was really interested in how do personalized recommendation systems work? How does how do you leverage that? And I think that was my first kind of like step in that direction. And while working there, I got more and more interested in AI in general. And around that time, there was a lot of interesting things developing. And LLMs were already a big thing back then, but like small things like retrieval augmented generation have been already picking up. And I've been really following that closely. And around that time, I was like, it's been a bit like around 3 years that I was at Meta. And I think I took a lot, like I grew a lot, like personally and as a software engineer at Meta. But I think that's when I started feeling this need of, I really want to switch gears again and try to learn how things are actually moving beyond big tech. So that's when I made this decision of, I want to try to see how things are out there. And that's when I came across Cognee. And that's how I made this switch. I think when I was talking to people at Cognee, one of my first calls was with PhD scientists that were actually part of the team. And that was the final thing that sold me. I want to try this. Long story short, worked on Cognee a bit, and fast forward, here I am working on agentic systems at Bead.
This episode is brought to you by The Build, a new podcast from the guys behind Sincera, Mike O'Sullivan and Ian Myers. They built their company by figuring out clever solutions to a few important ad tech problems in the industry, and that's exactly what this show is about. Mike and Ian interview some of the smartest tech minds at Magnite, Chalice, DoubleClick, and LiveRamp to hear about how they identified opportunities, solved their hardest challenges, and grew their businesses in the process. This show is for you if you've had some of these breakthrough moments yourself, or if you're seeking inspiration for the next one. Listen to The Build with Mike O'Sullivan wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode is brought to you by .tech Domains, and this one hits close to home. Back in 2016, when I was building my own tech startup, I went on the hunt for that elusive .com. Looked high, looked low, and guess what I found? Nothing. What I did find cost me an arm and a leg. So I did what every founder does under pressure. Threw in extra letters, settled for the less than optimal name. And here's what I wish someone had said to me back then. Noah, you're building a tech startup. Just get a .tech domain. Tech startup, .tech domain. It could not be more obvious. It tells investors, customers, and anyone who looks at your website, really, that tech is at the core of your build. And I've kicked myself plenty since, especially when I see the clean and sharp names tech companies have landed on .tech. Nothing.tech, 1x.tech, Aurora.tech, CES.tech, Ultra.tech, Alice.tech, Neon.tech, Blaze.tech, Pi.tech. You get the idea. So take it from someone who learned it the hard way. If you're building a tech startup, don't overthink it. Secure your .tech domain today from any registrar of your choice. Amazing. That's super cool. And Cognee seems really interesting. I'm sure talking to those folks sealed the deal for you. Cognee being the agent infrastructure layer, right? It's a GraphRAG and semantic memory company. And your work there was on the agent infrastructure side. Your biggest design call was decoupling the MCP architecture. So multiple agentic systems can share unified memory through a standalone process, right? That's a mouthful, but you know what I'm saying. Rather than each one coupling to its own Python runtime. Walk us through what problem that was solving and the key decision in the design that you made there.
Around that time, when I was working at Cognee, working on this MCP piece, it's been gaining traction a lot. Even when I was just joining, it's like the Cognee has been a big open source project with a lot of followers. And the next big thing that was there was people were using this graph system as a personalized layer of memory. But the next big thing was shared memory across multiple people. You could think of we already had some use cases where companies were using this as one layer that was shared by all the employees. And the growing thing was this MCP layer that people were using as MCP was picking up. And MCP was one of the most frequently used interfaces to interact with the memory layer. And the bottleneck that I discovered and later on improved on was MCP was its own thing, standalone. So you could have Cognee as a graph memory, or you could have it as a graph plus MCP, but there was not much of a decoupling there. So when you wanted to have one MCP memory for all the people to share, that was a kind of a hard thing to make it work. So the next thing that I worked on was just decoupling it, making it possible for you to work with Cognee as one big shared memory, but across multiple MCP clients. Yeah, I think I went a bit into maybe the not so interesting technical jargon there, but I think that was kind of the way I got there.
Oh, it's very interesting jargon. Yeah, don't shortchange yourself on that. That's interesting stuff. Okay, so let's actually dive into that a little bit further, into the shared memory, right? So you went through that process, and I'm curious about like an example, right, of an agent task that breaks when each agent has its own vector store, but works when there's this unified state that you're referring to through the decoupled MCP architecture, right? Well, and I'm curious, like, what's the actual mechanism that makes the difference there?
A really interesting use case that we came across like with people that were using Cognee was multiple agentic systems that were built on different frameworks. You can think of like Google Agent Developer Kit and LangGraph based agentic system that were actually like solving different problems, but really needed a shared understanding of the knowledge graph. And that was the piece that was breaking, because up until that point, those were isolated from each other. But when you wanted to make those two systems work and build on shared knowledge graph, that's when you were actually blocked. And that's one of the first things that this thing that I worked on has unblocked. And even at that time, we were already supporting, I think, around 5 very popular agentic frameworks. And after that change that like I worked on, you could mix and match all of them and make them work concurrently on the same knowledge graph and make it like grow independently and concurrently.
Super cool. That's really interesting. So in this space, most engineers like come from machine learning or an applications background. I'm primarily applications for my background, and you're coming at agent infrastructure from a pure distributed systems lens. What does that lens let you see that the ML native crowd is missing?
I think in the distributed systems, first thing is idempotency and like retries. So across distributed systems, you may not always have things work. Things work very randomly. Back then, I was also working in Cognee on this up and coming platform that we were building. And the thing was, up until then, the memory layer was just on your local system. It was up there. You were the only person that was using it. Maybe multiple processes on your local machine, but that was pretty much it. But going forward, like with this platform and spinning up and like more and more use cases where people were like sharing the same memory layer across distributed computes, there were these pieces of distributed systems that were coming into the picture. Network is not that reliable. The same things don't work from the first try, so you have to do retries. Then there's like competing requests. So there come these pieces that become more and more important that were from my infra experience. So I would say like since like idempotency and retries, and then shared state across processes, even on the same machine. That's where I think these tiny nuances that are a bit annoying when you're a developer, but I think those are the problems that you like eventually would face when going into the distributed systems. I think that's the pieces that I was grateful to have learned when I joined and worked on Cognee.
This episode is sponsored by BrainGrid. Building with AI coding tools is exciting until the moment things start breaking. You ask for a small change and suddenly 3 other features stop working. AI gets confused, misses edge cases, and loses track of your intent. The problem is not code generation. The problem is planning. That is why BrainGrid exists. BrainGrid acts as your product management agent. It writes clear specification, maps UX flows, asks the clarifying questions you forgot to ask, and breaks big ideas into engineering-grade tasks that AI coding tools can build reliably. It guides Cursor, Claude Code, Replit, Windsurf, and others so they deliver features that work and keep working. Founders use BrainGrid to build real AI-native SaaS products without a technical background. If you want reliable features instead of fragile prototypes, try BrainGrid for free at braingrid.ai. That's braingrid.ai. This episode is sponsored by Mesmo. If you're responsible for reliability, performance, or platform architecture, you already know the problem. Telemetry volume is growing faster than teams can manage it. Mesmo addresses this by moving observability upstream. Instead of storing everything and asking questions later, Mesmo processes telemetry in motion, filtering, transforming, and enriching logs, metrics, and traces before they reach your observability backend. The result is cleaner data, reduced ingestion costs, and faster root cause analysis using the tools you already rely on. Mesmo integrates with platforms like Datadog, Dynatrace, and open source stacks, giving teams more control without adding operational overhead. This is especially useful for platform engineers and SREs supporting complex distributed systems where context and speed matter. To see how active telemetry works in practice, get a demo at mesmo.com/codestory. That's MEZMO.com/codestory. Sure. No, that makes sense. That makes sense how that transferred and gave you something, a view that most people didn't have. Let's move into Bead. So the Bead AI. Bead AI is an Andreessen Horowitz-backed startup and going after compliance audits, right? Which isn't the obvious first market for autonomous agents, but as a startup founder myself, it is something that's really an interesting space to go take on. And you joined as a founding engineer in January, and you're shaping the technical core. From your seat, what makes compliance audits the right wedge for agent infrastructure? And I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. And what are the foundational decisions you're making today that will define what the product can do 2 years from now?
I've been like an avid user of the autonomous systems. I was really keen on learning where was Bead going, and I was really like captivated by their mission when I was first applying to them. From the first question, what makes compliance audit the right wedge for agent infrastructure is agents these days and autonomous systems in general, they're moving really fast. They're like with every new release, they're becoming more and more knowledgeable, much more smart than previous versions. And what I've learned firsthand by building agentic systems here at Bead and in general is they are super good if you know how to leverage them. And so much so that I think I'm really confident that there are so many more spaces that agentic systems will be able to work on par, if not much better than humans going forward. And I think audits are like this already behind the wave, like meaning that the wave has already surpassed the capabilities necessary to solve this very efficiently. And I think we're really in a good place in that sense. Really good perks of being a founding engineer is you are really like one of the foundational pieces of the team. So beyond being just a software engineer, I'm also taking part in the key decisions day to day. There are so many big important decisions that we make on like day in and day out. And I'm really grateful. And I think it's really fulfilling work in that sense because your decisions are literally guiding where this company is going. And feeling this kind of responsibility and with some time later down the stream, seeing the results of your own decisions is really fulfilling. So I think it's really a nice place to be, both like I think as a company, but also as a person, as a founding engineer.
This episode is sponsored by Unblocked. Your coding agents have access to your code base. Maybe you even connected other tools via MCPs, but access doesn't mean context. Agents can't reason across MCPs. They don't know your architectural decisions, your team's patterns, or why the API was shaped the way it is. So agents look in the wrong place and deliver bad outputs. Then you spend time correcting. More loops, more tokens. Unblocked is the context layer your agents are missing. It synthesizes your PRs, docs, Slack, and tickets into organizational context that agents actually understand. So they make better plans, write higher quality code, use fewer tokens, and require fewer correction loops. If you're running Claude Code, Cursor, or any agentic workflow, Unblocked is worth a look. Learn more at getunblocked.com/codestory. Certainly. No, that makes a lot of sense. And your statement about it being behind the curve a little bit, or that's not necessarily behind as a company, but the technology is there to solve that problem and solve it well, right? And so that's really cool. It's a cool position to be in and kind of coming out as one of the front runners in solving compliance there. I'm curious, in that sort of space, in this sort of agentic era, you're obviously a professional and an expert in this space. Tell me a claim you have around agent infrastructure that most people in this space maybe would push back on. So what is your contrarian view maybe of agent infrastructure? And tell me how you defend it against a dissenting voice.
That's a good one. I think I'm still maybe a dissenting voice in that sense. Maybe lately a little less, but still I think this is something that maybe some people would disagree with me, and maybe I'm also like, this comes with a bit of a bias given my background in infrastructure, but I firmly believe that, at least right now, sandboxing is the only real safety boundary for autonomous agents. There's prompts, there's a lot of layers of safety that you can leverage. But at the end of the day, especially with so many famous supply chain attacks that are happening these days, I firmly believe that sandboxing is the only safety that you can actually rely on when things don't go as planned. And I think maybe going forward, this might change a bit, but right now I'm a firm believer that this might be right now the only thing that you can confidently rely on. This is also like in a sense, guides my decisions, especially like right now when working at Bead, because it guides my decisions with safety in mind. And I might be a bit pedantic in that sense, but you can never be too safe when it comes to, especially I think, client data and people like relying on you. So I think that would be my claim that I would stick by.
Yeah, I would stick by it too. I'm right there with you. I think that makes sense. And you have to be careful, especially in a compliance solution, right? People's data, people's processes, certifications, perhaps even audit results, things like that. It's really important. And you got to be careful with all those things. So I certainly agree with you there. So with Bead AI, and without breaking anything confidential, what's the hardest unsolved problem on your plate? Now we know what Bead AI is and how you're using agents to solve compliance problems. What's the biggest unsolved problem and how are you approaching it?
One of the problems that I would probably flag, it's not something that I haven't solved per se, but I think there's still room for growth. One of those things for me would be evals. I own this thing and I work on it every day. I think there is always room for growth there because evals are the backbone of how you evaluate your system's performance and how you safeguard it against regressions and basically like some actual source of sanity check for your agentic system. I think the challenge there that I'm kind of like trying to solve, one of the things that on my plate that I would want it to be better is there's this thing that you like the actual product that works with the sensitive data and everything. And there's this evals, which we try to make it like you try to make it as close as possible to the actual workflows and things that happen on production. But there's always this tiny gap because the data that agentic systems are fed with, they're always unique. Each client, each use case, it has its own slight quirk. And you can try to replicate it locally, but there's still this tiny gap that I'm maybe being a bit perfectionistic, still uncomfortable with. And although I think we're in a good place, I'm always trying to chase that last 20% or maybe 1%, but I would love to make it better. So I think, that would be first thing that would come to my mind when I'm thinking about that.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Obviously, it's full of problems to solve, which is why the company exists and why you have the work set before you. But that's a good one. Okay, Daulet, last question. 2 years from now, what's the piece of agent infrastructure that we'll consider obviously necessary, but doesn't exist yet? So like the electricity of the agent infrastructure for each future or the water, right? What's going to be the utility? Who builds it? And what does it look like?
I think this is an interesting, and maybe I'm kind of like stepping a little too into the future, but I think going forward with more, as you mentioned, and as I touched on, this curve is going to go further. And with that in mind, there's going to be more and more problems that agentic systems will be able to solve efficiently. And with more and more things being handled by agentic systems, at some point, there's going to be this necessity of regulating it a bit. But right now, agentic systems are like, there are software engineers and software teams that are behind them. But going forward, I think there's going to be a necessity maybe to have some sort of a identity and capability registry for individual agents. So in that sense, you can think of individual agents being uniquely identifiable by their capabilities and also by the things that they've changed and worked on. So that you can think of maybe European Union being like forerunner in this. Because if you think about it, I think with things being handled by agentic systems, you would probably at some point ask yourself, how do we find the responsible entity for the actions that this agentic system has taken? And I think at some point there's going to be maybe discussion of, there's going to be a need for assigning identities to individual agents. And maybe I'm this is going a bit into futuristic scenarios, but I think I can see this happening in the near future. So I think that's going to be probably one of the next steps in agentic systems infrastructure that's going to come into reality.
That's interesting. No, I appreciate you sharing your view there, and we'll pencil that down and see if it starts to come to life. And maybe we'll have you back on the show. So if it happens, and we'll have a conversation about it. Thanks for being on the show today. You have had an interesting, fruitful career, spending time in reliability and then moving into more agentic space and now landing at Bead AI. It's clear that your experience is built on top of itself to set the stage for your success at this company and the problems you're solving. So as well as while AI in the industry continues to mature from an agentic and model perspective, you're well positioned to keep your finger on the tabs, utilize the technology that comes out and solve problems for the compliance space. So Daulet, again, I appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been an interesting discussion. Hopefully, as mentioned, maybe if possible, like in 2 years' time, we'll be able to come back to this and discuss this in retrospect.
Absolutely. Discuss those predictions. We'll make sure and do that.
Looking forward to it.
You can clearly see how Daulet's career has led forward into a foundational moment for what he is building at Bead AI. The combination of reliability, infrastructure experience, and AI backbone infrastructure, Daulet is well positioned to solve the next big problem using AI: compliance. If you'd like to connect with Daulet, check the show notes for all the appropriate links. And thanks again for listening.
Capital One's tech team isn't just talking about multi-agentic AI. They already deployed one. It's called Chat Concierge, and it's simplifying car shopping. Using self-reflection and layered reasoning with live API checks, it doesn't just help buyers find a car they love. It helps schedule a test drive, get pre-approved for financing, and estimate trade-in value. Advanced, intuitive, and deployed. That's how they stack. That's technology at Capital One.
Most people don't realize how much their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions pulling details about you from public records and the internet, and then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might sell just credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together, at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/remove. Protect yourself now at aura.com/remove.